What's up, wonderful creatures of earth? Thank you very much for clicking this video. Our passage of today from the book of wisdom, before we dive into the reaction videos, comes from Acts 3 from 25. And this is what it says. And you are heirs of the prophets and of the covenant God made with your fathers. He said to Abraham, through your offspring, all peoples on earth will be blessed. When God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. Good vibe soul, God is great at all times, and we acknowledge it's with the help of God that we are gathered here today, my friend, to spread love, peace, honesty, and forgiveness to the whole world. And for that reason alone, my friend, we shall give thanks before we start our show today. Let's give thanks to our Creator. Thank you, dear Lord Father, for your love, for your goodness. Thank you, dear Lord, for peace and the joy in our hearts. Dear Lord Father, this beautiful day that you have joined us together with your lovely soul, guide us through, Father, to spreading love as we watch these videos together. Help us to understand all these videos, Father, and to reach all people in the whole world. In Jesus' mighty name, we do pray, trusting and believing. Amen. I am Y311H, and it's a pleasure to be your host today. Let's dive into spreading love and good vibes.
If clouds can weigh up to 500 cars, how do they float? Government space lasers. The thing you have to remember is that the sky isn't empty. If it was, then it would look like this. Basically what you see on the moon. But our atmosphere is full of moisture and nitrogen, and that makes it a fluid. A fluid is basically anything that changes its shape based on the thing it's in. Like coffee or blowing up a balloon. Meaning that liquid and gas are both fluids. With that being said, the sky is similar to the ocean in the sense that the deeper you go, the more of it is crushing you. There's about 15 pounds pressing down on every square inch of you right now. Basically, the atmosphere is heavy and thick. Once you wrap your head around that, clouds make a bit more sense. Clouds are made of very small water droplets and sometimes ice crystals. On their own, they're too small and light to plummet. Like the dust floating around in your grandma's very haunted attic. The particles are less dense than the air below, allowing things to float. The droplets actually are slowly making their way down. It's just hard to notice. It's not until clouds become too heavy from the accumulation of condensed water that it turns into rain or snow, which is much more noticeable. They lied.
Toe walking is common in kids as they learn to walk, but it can also be a sign of other medical conditions. A 7-year-old boy is brought to my office after being referred to me from his pediatrician. He's been toe walking for a while, but his mom thought he would just grow out of it. He's also had problems with recurrent urinary tract infections that have had them been treated with antibiotics. Upon further questioning, he's also had problems with back pain and intermittent leg pain that was attributed to growing pains. On physical examination, he had full strength in his upper and lower extremities and normal sensation, but when he did walk, he tended to toe walk a little bit, and after looking at his back, there was a small patch of hair right on his lower back. Here is the MRI of the patient's lumbar spine that was ordered. So what do you see on this MRI that seems to be abnormal? Is the answer A, a herniated disc in his lower back, B, spina bifida with tethered cord syndrome, C, a tumor in the patient's lumbar spine, or D, he'll just grow out of it? Let me know what you think the answer is, and I'll go through the whole case tomorrow.
Why don't manufacturers use the inline 7 engine? It sounds pretty unique, I'm not gonna lie. This thing sounds pretty wicked. Now, slapping on an extra cylinder for more power is nothing new. That's basically how you get the Audi RS3. It's a Golf R with an extra cylinder, and that car has absolutely changed the game when it comes to compact performance cars. So it only makes sense to take an inline 6, add an extra cylinder, and make a 3JZ, an inline 7. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. With the inline 6, you can see that it's basically a mirror image front to back of the cylinders, and also they have very, very good, if not perfect, primary and secondary balance. That is just not the case with the inline 7. If you divide 7 cylinders by 720 crankshaft degrees for a 4-stroke cycle, you start to get fractions, and that never works when it comes to building a crankshaft. Plus, this engine has horrible balance literally everywhere. It will shake itself apart. Now, these do exist in the wild, but only in like industrial and marine applications, like the AGCO HD98. It's like 470 horsepower and 1,300 pound-feet of torque at 2,000 RPM, because anything more than that, the crank is coming out the bottom of this bitch. Now, in a production car setting, if you can fix the balance issues, possibly, but in a transverse setup, absolutely not. In a longitudinal setup, the hood is going to be longer than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's not practical, but at least it sounds cool though.
Hurricane in Milton. My God, this is crazy. Combined with the tornado. Oh, good people of Earth. Look at these crazy weather occurrences. Wonderful souls watching
Eva
from
Mendes is
tornado.
getting absolutely dragged in her comment section right now after making this Instagram post. What was the post about, you might ask? Well, it's pretty simple. She was calling on Kellogg's to remove harmful artificial food dyes from the cereals sold in the United States. She was citing a food blogger named Vani Hari, also known as the Food Babe, who pointed out that the US version of Fruit Loops has a bunch of artificial food coloring in it, red 40, yellow 5, blue 1, yellow 6, yada yada. Whereas the Canadian version doesn't have those artificial food dyes in it. They use other things to color the Fruit Loops, such as you can see here, concentrated carrot juice, watermelon juice, blueberry juice. So much more, I would say, natural food coloring ingredients. Perfectly reasonable, I think, to question why Kellogg's is selling the most toxic version of the same product in America, but not in other countries. But this triggered quite the backlash in our comment section with a bunch of people, namely nutritionists and PhDs and quote-unquote experts, saying that the Food Babe is not a legitimate source, that she's spreading tons of misinformation. So I looked into this a little bit, and there's something you should know about these experts. For example, Dr. Andrea Love. She says, "Hi, Eva Mendes. These ingredients aren't banned whatsoever, and they have been deemed safe across the entire planet. The Food Babe is not a credible source of information on these topics at all." Well, this is Dr. Andrea Love. She's got all the right credentials. She's an immunologist, microbiologist, decades and decades of experience in training and clinical research, yada, yada. But she's also, if you can see here, a columnist for a nonprofit called the Genetic Literacy Project. If you do a little bit of digging, the Genetic Literacy Project has been outed as a PR front for Monsanto, Bayer, and the chemical industry. This is their IRS Form 990, where they have to disclose where they get all their money from. You can see here at the top of the list, number one, biggest contributor, $100,000, Bayer. A little bit of conflict of interest there, eh? Well, let's talk about this lady, Danielle Shine. She is a registered dietitian. She says that, unfortunately, Ava, you've been misled. The Food Babe is not a qualified food nutrition professional. She lacks crucial food, nutrition, and health science knowledge. Without this foundation, everything can appear to be a threat to health, which simply isn't true. Well, something that is definitely true is that, according to the Washington Post, the food industry actually pays these influencer dietitians to shape your eating habits. They say that registered dietitians are being paid to post videos that promote diet soda, sugar, supplements on Instagram and TikTok. And another fact we know to be 100% true, unfortunately sort of an inconvenient truth, is that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has a record of quid pro quo with a range of food giants, with money being tracked flowing from big food into the hands of these nutritionists and dietitians. And guess which company just happens to be one of the highest contributors of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics? Of course, Kellogg's. And so now you see how all these experts work, right? It's pay for play. They can cry misinformation all they want, but the receipts, they don't lie.
Here are 5 foods that you should never feed to your chickens. Number 1 is green tomatoes or any part of the tomato plant. They contain a chemical called solanine, and it can be extremely toxic if your chickens ingest it. On the other hand, fully ripe tomatoes are beneficial to chickens and they will go crazy over them. One of my chicken's favorite snacks is a cold ripe tomato. Number 2 is avocado. The skin and the seed are toxic to chickens, but a little bit of the flesh is okay for them. Little side note, chickens love bananas, but moderation is key because they're a little bit high in sugar and too much can cause diarrhea. Number 3 is moldy chicken feed or table scraps. Chickens can get botulism if they ingest moldy feed. This is a toxic disorder that completely paralyzes a chicken from the neck down. It is a very serious condition that is almost always fatal. Number 4 and 5 is bread and pasta. A lot of people will argue this, but I will never feed my flock bread or pasta. They are just too high in carbohydrates, and this can cause major health issues for your flock. A chicken's intestines can swell up if you feed them too much bread or pasta. Before I knew this, when I was first starting out, I was feeding them bread and one of my chickens had a huge prolapse. I then cut out major carbs for good. I'm Simply Chickens. Follow me for chicken keeping tips.
What they found is that the eldest sibling is typically born with the highest IQ, partly because their parents do make the most amount of mistakes raising them. So they actually have to learn real-world issues and learn from their issues. They learn from their problems. So damaging your child a little bit actually gives them the opportunity to learn and fix those things and become a little bit more intelligent. That's part one. And then with each sibling that you have, it's about a 3 to 4% decrease in IQ points, generally speaking. And so the youngest is usually the most shit out of luck. But 3 to 4% IQ points for most people is about 1 to 1.5 points lower. It's not very significant. But across family members, it could, on average, it's about 12 points difference.
This is blood from a patient with malaria, and it's zoomed in. This is what you can see. Some of them are infected with Plasmodium, the red blood cells. The protozoan Plasmodium infects red blood cells that causes malaria. This is crazy. Neutrophil Plasmodium. It's hard to imagine that mosquitoes can do this damage. Infection occurs when Plasmodium-infected Anopheles mosquito bites you. Plasmodium gets inside the blood. This is now blood infected with lethal parasite that causes sleeping sickness. This is crazy. You can also see the parasites that cause sleeping sickness. Every dot here, my friend, is them. These parasites are called some hard name, hard name. Let's continue. Infection occurs when infected Sesofly bites a human. Oh, look at this. And now, my friend, this leads to sleeping sickness. And is always
when
lethal
science
if
debunks its own myths with new evidence, and for the longest time, I believed the myth that the long tongues of woodpeckers served as shock absorbers so they wouldn't get concussed when they're pecking on trees. But it turns out that's not the case. Check this out. So if you didn't know it, woodpeckers have really long tongues, and most other birds don't. Most birds can't extend their tongues much past the end of their beak, but woodpeckers and a few other groups like hummingbirds can extend their tongues way past the end of their beak, and the way that they do that is having evolved an extra long tongue that is literally wrapped around the inside of the skull, around the brain, and is rooted just under the nostrils on the upper mandible of the beak. And for the longest time, biologists just assumed that this long wraparound tongue served, at least in part, as a shock absorber to take some of the force and energy away from the brain as these woodpeckers are hammering on wood. Turns out that's not the case. This is literally just an adaptation to house an extra long tongue. And in what came as a shock to all 5 of us who are fascinated by bird tongues, this paper from 2022 showed that not only does the tongue not serve a shock absorption purpose, but that woodpecker skulls have very little, if any, shock absorption adaptations. And in fact, they have been adapted to be these rock-solid hammers for hammering and delivering maximum force to the trees or whatever it is they're hammering, they're pecking on. And as I mentioned, hummingbirds are another group with this amazing adaptation for extra long tongues. They wrap their tongues around their skulls that actually are rooted kind of under and behind the eye. And then when the tongue is extended past the tip of the beak, many hummingbird tongues are forked and feathery so that they can soak up that nectar when they extend it into the flower for a meal.
This world is not what we've been told, and I think this video is going to be an excellent entry point for you to show any family member messing with us. I don't think so, because I've zoomed way in and I've explored a lot of this terrain, and to me it's all legitimate. It's legitimate to the point where on that dragon up there are literally scales littered throughout the terrain. The dragon in red that takes up almost the entire state of Utah. But of course, this is all for entertainment purposes. You guys know I just like shits and gigs and laughs. Entertainment only.
Oh my goodness, oh my gosh, it's a tornado.
Do you know what this means? It's the biting of the lower lips. When it's done, just one side like this means more concern, anxious. But if you bite right in the middle, that's me more flitting, because when you bite, make your lips look more red. Different gestures, different meanings, and different concepts.
Don't freak out, but NASA just canceled their asteroid hunting mission. The WISE telescope was launched to space in 2009, and it did awesome work. It discovered millions of hidden black holes and discovered a new class of stars. And then 2 years later, it was put into hibernation until NASA decided to repurpose it into a new mission called NEOWISE, and its goal since then has been to discover asteroids and comets near Earth. Since it launched, this spacecraft, WISE and NEOWISE, has discovered thousands and thousands of asteroids. Minor planets is a fancy word for asteroids. But since the sun is getting more active and this spacecraft has been in space for a really long time, it's been slowly falling back towards Earth. And while a lot of it will burn up in Earth's atmosphere, some of it will probably hit Earth later this year. So the asteroid hunter has become the asteroid. In a few years, in 2027, NASA is going to launch a new spacecraft called NEO Surveyor, and its job from the beginning is to find 2/3 of all large objects near Earth within 5 years. And until that time, don't worry about it, we'll be fine.
This is a startup that's trying to redirect sunlight using mirrored satellites to light up parts of the Earth where it's dark out, sort of like an inverse Mr. Burns situation on The Simpsons when he was trying to block out the sunlight. It's causing kind of a stir on the Twitters, or the X. The commotion I'm concerned about is where optical science is being misunderstood. Specifically, this post that I replied to that was talking about the inverse square law. And I'm glad people know about what that is, but you should know what that is if you're gonna quote it. This guy is saying that this idea is infeasible because of inverse square law, because he says that it states that the light intensity decreases with the square of the distance from the source. He's saying, oh, if you use any sort of optics up in the sky, by the time it gets to the Earth, it's going to be so dim it won't matter. But this is an incorrect interpretation of the inverse square law. Now, if you go to Google, you'll see what this person said repeated, and that doesn't mean that it's right. I'm going to explain what's going on, but you're going to have to bear with me because we're going to go into understanding units of light. And normally when one of my colleagues tries to explain to a group of other engineers this part of what we do, I'm like, great, you just lost everybody in the room. They're not going to learn anything now. But this is one of those things where we actually have to learn about the units. So let's use this diagram, even though it's not correctly labeled, to kind of understand what this guy is trying to say. So we got a point source here. That means a light source that has light rays coming out evenly in all directions. And if you measure how many rays of light we have at this surface, this distance away from the source, we'll say we got 5 rays of light over this tiny little postage stamp thing here. Now, as we go out further in distance, then that area that those 5 rays are going to fit inside is going to be bigger. So the number of rays divided by the area becomes smaller. But intensity isn't number of rays divided by area. At least it's not anymore. If we refer to my textbook, copyrighted in 2002, I had this note on the page about the inverse square law, and it said in the past, generally physicists would use the word intensity to mean flow of energy per unit area per unit time. But we've changed our minds, and now we use the word irradiance. Why is that? Well, because intensity, radiant intensity, and luminous intensity, they mean something else. They are divided by a steradian. Instead of dividing it by, like here you might have 1 square meter, 1 square meter. Here you might have 4 square meters. Instead, if you're going with actual radiant intensity, you're dividing by a steradian, which doesn't change as you move out. It expands along with those rays expanding in space. So if in intensity you measure 5 here, it's going to be 5 here, it's going to be 5 here. It doesn't change because the thing you're dividing it by is the same. It's only when you're talking about a different unit, irradiance, where you're actually dividing by like square meters, say, which does change as you go through space. So that's one thing, okay? So this should not say intensity, this should say irradiance. That changes. And maybe you're thinking, well, what does it matter what you call it? It's still less light, Aaron. So we're talking about irradiance. Okay, but also, this example is with a point source. And if you've watched my videos before, you know that point sources are theoretical constructs that don't actually exist in reality, and therefore explaining things like inverse square law. But isn't the sun a point source? Yeah, kind of, but it still doesn't matter. See, people imagine the sun and the earth like this. And if that were true, then yeah, we'd be getting rays that hit here at this angle, and then straight at us, all these different angles. But we're much further away from that. We are actually more like over here. So the rays that make it from the sun all the way to the earth are actually gonna be all parallel. Doop. We'll see that the rays come here and here and here. You're gonna have 3 over this surface area, and it's gonna be the same surface area it subtends here. Doesn't change. So it's the same density pretty much. So that also means that if you have a satellite that's a flat mirror, then you're gonna have parallel rays hitting that, and then they're still gonna be parallel when they go to the Earth down here. They're not gonna be diverging. Not noticeably, at least, and that's what matters, because we're talking about how many rays over a surface area. If it diverges, then there's going to be less rays over that surface area. There's going to be less sunlight power over a surface area. Another thing to keep in mind is that's only if you're not concentrating the light with multiple facets of a giant reflector, which is kind of what they're doing. So if that's happening, then you would actually have the opposite of diverging light. You'd have converging light, which means you could have more rays per surface area down here than you have up here. We can look at this yet another way if you still are like, no, Aaron, the sun is basically a point source, so let's do the inverse square law math. Okay, let's use this formula. We'll say that we have 100, we won't label it, just 100 units of intensity, which should be irradiance. And those 100 units are going to hit the satellite at a distance from the sun of 94 million miles. This side of the equation will look like 100 times 94 million squared. Now to see the distance of those 100 units of intensity between the satellite and when it gets to Earth, we're going to solve for this intensity 2. But then the distance from this distance to this distance is only going to be maybe 100 miles because these are low Earth orbit satellites. So distance 2 squared, that variable, is going to be 94,100,000 squared. And so if I solve for intensity 2 by dividing that 94,100,000 squared into this side, then we get 99.99978723438 out of 100 that we had at the satellite mirror. That's how much we'll have actually on the ground. So we're not losing that much because it's not spreading out that much. Now, if this weren't a specular reflector, if it weren't a mirror finish, if it were like a very reflective piece of white something, then that would be spreading out in a whole bunch of different directions, and then that would change things. But that's not what we're talking about here. It's taking almost parallel rays of light and making them almost parallel somewhere else. So yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility, and they've already demonstrated it with some hot air balloons. Look, that's a picture of it. Isn't that crazy? So that, and then also just keep in mind Inverse square law doesn't apply to radiant intensity or luminous intensity. Those divide by steradians. That changes with you as you go out in space. And it should be irradiance or illuminance. Those things are units where it's divided by square meters or something like that. We got it? Or did I lose yet? I think I might have lost some people. If I need to re-explain that in a simpler way, let me know.
If you found this video, then you are on the timeline of ascension. I know you feel it deep in your soul. You feel a sense of inner peace, even though your world might look the same as other people's. Your bank account might look the same. You might still have that same headache from yesterday, but your inner peace is what guarantees that you are on the timeline of ascension. And as the timelines begin to deepen, as the timelines and the manifestations become more apparent, because you're not reacting to chaos in the same way as other people living in your home, as your friends, as most of the world, not only will you receive a different outcome, but you're going to be much less relatable to other people who all they really want to do is find catharsis and to complain and to vent and to exacerbate the timeline that they're on. And because the reality right now is shaking our ego, which means that it's poking on our deepest sense of insecurities, our deepest fears, it might seem to some people that the world is ending. But in that space, you only know peace because your world has already ended. Your ego has already ended. It's already given up to the presence of your heart and to the presence of your spirit. So it's okay if you're unrelatable. It's okay if there's all of these other spiritual people and psychics and people predicting that there's going to be the end of the world. I have conversations like this very frequently with some very gifted, talented psychics and seers and mediums who are seeing not the end of the world, but a long and extended war. And as I feel into it, from my place on this timeline, I feel the war is already happening. If you could look inside people's minds, inside their energy, they are already at war. This election, people are up in arms. I was just outside walking my dog and my neighbor was talking about the convention and politics and it got so heated so instantly, and I was just walking my dog, and I think they're cool people, right? But it was like the instant that he saw that I had no response, he just calmed down. He said, oh, well, we probably believe in the same thing anyway, so it doesn't matter. Which is so funny because that's exactly how the world is going to be if you can hold your ground of peace. And I love this little light because it's like you're going to pull it, the light bulb's going to go off. If you can hold your place of peace and calm, the people around you will soften and they will begin to see, oh, there is a different path that's available to me. Maybe I can't change the political system. I can't change the economic social system. But with this internal system, that's all that matters. And then you turn on your internal guidance. And that gets you to where you want to go, but even better and beyond. And in a time that is so loving and healing and perfect for you. So you are receiving this because you're on the same timeline that I am. And if you feel a little wonky about it, just listen to your heart. Just come back to your heart. Trust the peace that is within your soul. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. That is the only thing that's real. Everything else out here, it's just meant to poke your ego.